All right, and we're live. Hello, this is Christian Idealism, and today we're going to have a little discussion about epistemological skepticism. And so the reason why I'm doing this discussion with David here is, first of all, David, he's studied epistemology a lot more than I have. So, I don't know how many books you got on epistemology,
It's got to be probably 500-600 at this point. So.
yeah. So, we got David, but also I've been getting a lot of emails about this topic as well. I don't know why. I don't understand. I guess it's just, I don't know if it's coincidence or maybe people are kind of forcing me to do this sort of thing. It's definitely not something that I study. It's not, epistemology is not really, even though I think it's important, it's not like my main area of focus. So I'm here with David to sort of answer the problem of epistemological skepticism. But before we get there, I guess we should start off with the introduction to epistemology. What is epistemology? How do we come to understand things? So David, if you could help me out, what is epistemology? What's the main sort of views?
Right. Epistemology, it's the study of knowledge. And so what is knowledge? Traditional definition is justified true belief. We understand that, with the Gettier problem and stuff, that's not exactly an uncontroversial definition anymore. But for our purposes here, knowledge will be a justified true belief. And so, the question is, how do you get there, right? Because obviously we don't just want true beliefs, right? We do want true beliefs, but we want to, know why they're true. We want to have reasons for them. We don't just, want to pick beliefs out of a hat and hope that they're true. So there's got to be that extra condition there of justification. And that's really the one that skeptics try to go after, is to show that, we have no justification. And so broadly, the two approaches for dealing with skepticism here would be internalism and externalism. So an externalist theory of epistemic justification says that your belief is justified, basically, or they don't even like the term justification. They might say warranted. But you'd have positive epistemic status for your beliefs if they kind of come about through a reliable process, right? So you've got process reliabilism, right, with Alvin Goldman. You've got Alvin Plantinga's theory of warrant and proper function. The whole idea behind externalism is that your beliefs come about through a reliable process. And so basically you can trust the beliefs that you have, even if you don't know the reasons why. That's externalism, and you don't really have to deal with skepticism if you're an externalist, because you just essentially begin by begging the question against it. You begin by assuming that your beliefs come about through a reliable process, because you can't prove that, certainly not in a non-circular way. If you did, then you wouldn't be an externalist anymore. So if you're cool with that, you're cool with assuming that your beliefs are that they just came about through a reliable process, don't know why, then problem skepticism disappears. If you're an internalist like me, then justification depends on reasons, evidence, things that you are aware of. And so you would take skepticism much more seriously. In fact, people sometimes ask me, how do I know if I'm an internalist or an externalist? And the question I'll often put to them is, what do you think of epistemic skepticism? Is that something you take seriously, or is that something that you just don't care about? You don't care about it, you're probably going to be an externalist. If you actually want to refute skepticism, then you'll probably be an internalist. So those are the two broad camps of epistemic justification, and skepticism only becomes a big deal if you're an internalist.
Right, because that is a sort of popular objection to internalism, where it's well, if you're an internalist, then you have to sort of try to avoid all these skeptical scenarios. So we're going to try to do that today. We're going to try to, examine these skeptical scenarios and try to find our way out of them. Right. So the first thing, I guess before we get into how we solve the problem, or at least the different types, because there's different types of problems. So the first thing we need to understand is the different types of skepticism, right? So you have the sort of academic skeptics, but then you have the priorian skeptics. Is that what they call it?
Yeah.
Priorian. Okay. So the academic skeptics, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, would say that they know that they can't know anything, right? Now, of course, that's self-defeating, right? So if you know that you can't know anything, well, do you know that, right? So obviously, I think academic skepticism seems to be self-defeating, at least on the face of it. So that's why most skeptics go with the priorian view, which is basically that we don't know that we don't know. Essentially, it's basically how I like the view of it. I don't know if you agree with me, but the way I sort of view it is when you ask the question, is knowledge possible? What the priorian would say was like, they'll say that I don't know if knowledge is possible. So they won't say no. They won't deny the possibility of knowledge, right? Because if they deny it, then there has to be knowledge, right? They have to know that they deny knowledge, right? So what they're going to say is, I don't know if knowledge is possible, right? So is that what they would is that their sort of view?
Yeah. So I mean that it's good to make that distinction there between those two sorts. A ton of those skepticism. Actually, the way I prefer to look at it is between global skepticism and local skepticism, which local skepticism is much boring in my opinion, but it's basically a skepticism. It's skepticism of something like, is there an external world or something like that? It's not like there's no knowledge whatsoever. It's just in this one area where most people think you can have it. With respect to global skepticism, both of the types that you're talking about are sorts of global skepticism. And you're right, on the one hand, that it would be self-refuting to say that you know that knowledge is impossible. But some people treat that like that is a defeater for skepticism, and it's not.
Right.
Skepticism,
it's not, yeah.
Right. Some people be like, oh, well, I mean, I've had people argue about this, like really long conversations on my Facebook page, like 50 long comment threads.
Yeah.
Like, I'm trying to get people to understand that self-refutation doesn't work. Because yes, even though somebody can't know, if skepticism were true, obviously no one could know it. So if somebody says, oh, well, I know that no one knows anything, then okay, they're contradicting themselves.
Yeah,
but
right.
That doesn't prove that you can't actually know anything at all. So skepticism, like strong global skepticism, that could still be true. And in fact, if it was true, we wouldn't expect anyone to know it.
Right.
So because people also try to say, oh, well, the skepticism is out of the window, right? Because, no one can believe that, so why should I even deal with it?
Yeah.
Because if you've got a shred of intellectual honesty, that should still bother you. So
right.
That's kind of how I approach it, is that I take skepticism seriously. I take strong global skepticism seriously, and I don't try to say, oh, it's self-refuting, and so I don't have to deal with it.
Yeah, that is interesting because I guess people would sort of say, oh, well, if skepticism, if that's a position, like, how could you believe it, right? It's like, well, no one believes it. That's the point. Like, it's a claim about that we can't know anything. So that includes, that. I mean, that's what we would expect, right?
Exactly.
So yeah. Anyways, so now let's get to the skeptical scenario. So the first thing would be the regress problem, and I know you mentioned to me before that this is probably the sort of origin of the problem of skepticism. So I guess the regress problem is, how can we know, like, what's the chain of, so if you keep asking, well, how do you know that? Like, for example, I guess just one example, I think we would all accept this, hopefully, that the earth is round, right? Now, if you ask, well, how do you know that? It's like, well, because we observe it in astronomy. It's like, well, how do you know that? And it's like, well, because scientists said so. It's like, well, how do you know that? And you just keep going back and back, right? And this is because of the regress problem, that's where we get all the different views about how we ground knowledge, right? So you have the coherentists that will say that we know things through what's coherent. And then you have the foundationalist, which will say that we know things because there's some foundation for our beliefs, right? And of course, there might be other views, like there's infinitism, and we can sort of discuss that if you want. But so yeah, what are the different ways to solve the problem of the regress problem?
Yeah. The regress problem is important because I think that is really, like, nobody's really born a skeptic. Some of us, like you and me, are probably naturally a little more skeptical than most people, but no one's really born like a thoroughgoing skeptic. So it's something that you kind of, at least in my case, it was the existence of God, right? People kept, people would ask me, oh, well, how do you know that God exists? And so, then I started questioning things, and people could ask this, how do you know question for like any belief that I held, and whatever answer I gave, oh, good grief, they could ask it again. And so then you kind of begin to wonder, well, how far back does this go? And like, do I really need reasons for everything? Because, so that's the essence of the regress problem, is the skeptical argument from here is that there's no way to get justification, right? Because whatever belief it is that's justifying these other beliefs, it's going to need justification. And if we don't have justification that terminates at some point, right, then none of it's justified. It's just justified if something else is. So solutions, yeah. You've got contextualism, which would say that a belief pretty much ends with an unjustified belief, kind of a communal assumption or something like that, which is disturbingly popular right now, that view. But yeah, I'm not a fan of contextualism. I mean, it's easy to see problems with that, of course. Like, for example, just one serious problem is explaining how does the knowledge of what assumptions are acceptable, how does that get back to the individual? Because contextualists don't say just any assumption is okay. They say it's got to be, like a scientific contextualist will say it's got to be like a scientific consensus. Okay, how does that get back to me, right? How do I figure out what a scientific consensus is? And it's going to have to be like through reading and studying, and so based on my own evidence. But then, guess what? Knowledge didn't start with the contextual assumption. So, that's contextualism. You've got coherentism. It says, chains, they loop back on themselves. You don't really have any beliefs that are kind of justified in isolation. All the beliefs need each other. It's like a web. The more coherent your belief set is, then, the more justification you have. And of course, there's charges of circular reasoning. There's, of course, the isolation problem, which is basically this idea that you can basically justify any belief that you have just by providing a coherent framework for it.
Yeah.
Even if this belief is completely contradicted by like your overall evidence on something, if it's consistent with your other beliefs, then you should accept it. It's justified based on coherentism. And then there's infinitism, which is by far the most unpopular position, but says, belief chains, they go on forever, and yeah, I mean, it's not popular because, first of all, if you're an internalist and you think you need to be aware of the justifying reasons, then you can't be aware of an infinite chain of reasons. That's even assuming the chain exists. How do you know the chain exists? The infinitist doesn't, because they admit that they don't know all of the reasons. They just say, but they have to be there. So, infinitism is, I kind of agree with Stephen Porter. He says it's justification, skepticism in disguise. So the other alternative would be foundationalism. And it says that we have some beliefs that are non-inferentially justified. So beliefs that don't owe their justification to any further beliefs. And so these immediately justified beliefs serve as a foundation for the rest of knowledge. And so justification terminates with non-inferentially justified foundational beliefs.
Yeah, and I do sort of like that approach, and I'm a foundationalist myself, so this is a sort of foundation. I mean, the whole topic is a foundationalist answer to epistemological skepticism. So, of course, we would agree that foundationalism does provide the best solution to the regress problem, right? Now, there's a deeper problem, I think, that we should sort of discuss, which is the problem of the criterion. And this has to do with the starting point for knowledge itself. So basically, I think you could correct me on this, but like basically where it's like, well, how do we come to start off knowledge? Is it because of the method we use, or is it because of some prior evidence that we have, right? And that's where you get to the sort of dilemma issue. So, I mean, I don't know, how would you explain that problem?
Right. The problem with the criteria is an old argument. And basically, it's an attempt to show that there's no way that you can have non-circular justification for your arguments, because it goes with like these two questions that come up, right? What's the extent of our knowledge? And then what is it that we know? And it seems like you need the answer to one question in order to be able to answer the other one. But without an answer to either one, then you don't have an answer to either one, and so you don't actually have knowledge at all. And Roderick Chisholm did a lot of work on that, trying to make that a more popular, or to get it out there, basically to get solutions on it. His own solution, which is not really a solution, was just you can't solve it. He said there's no way to have knowledge without begging the question. So the two basic strategies would be Methodism, which says that, you've got to have some kind of idea for what constitutes knowledge before you can determine before determining if any of your beliefs fit it, or particularism. And particularism says, no, you start with particular items of knowledge. And so Methodism is pretty much dead in the water because in order to have a method, in order to have a criterion for what knowledge is, that's going to have to be knowledge. And so you've got a new infinite regress. So like, just forget about beliefs. Now you've got a criterial regress. So Methodism, I just don't think that it's got a leg to stand on. So we've got particularism. And so here, my solution to that, and there's about 10 of them out there, but my own solution to this problem would be what's called explanatory particularism. So explanatory particularism begins with this idea of the given. So givenness is it's a technical epistemological term, but it just refers to kind of this non-conceptual phenomenon that we are. It's not something that we take, right? So it's not a conclusion that we draw. It's something that we're given. So it would be like that I see a computer in front of me right now. I'm not inferring that belief from any other belief. It's something that's being given to me. And so, any belief like that, I would say that is a starting point. It doesn't beg the question against skepticism, right? Because I could be wrong that there's a computer there, but I can't be wrong that I'm perceiving it, right? So I've got this incorrigible belief that I seem to see this computer in front of me. And so in that way, it's not circular, because in no way do I have to presuppose the truth of this. I'm not, getting from premises to a conclusion. In fact, I would say this is a sort of a theory of premise acceptability, is that we've got these items of, or not even items of knowledge, but just this phenomenon that is given to you, and you can form a belief on that basis without any circularity whatsoever. And so the problem of the criterion, it goes away if you accept that.
Right, and so this gets into additional problems, which is the problem of induction and deduction. So then the issue, okay, so now, so you accept that, of course, that, and I would probably agree with you that, like, there's this given to us, like, I would say it's experience, right? So experience, I mean, this is one of the points I made in my last debate, where it's like, well, even if everything in the world is a complete illusion, like, I know that I'm experiencing something, right? And that's sort of the given, right? So now the question is, well, how do you justify beyond the given, right? And this gets into the problem of induction and deduction, right? So one of the questions that I've gotten is, how do we justify, for example, inductive inferences? So how do we justify the law of induction? How do we justify those sort of things that we use to get inferences, right? What's your sort of idea about that? Do you think that there's a link? Because I think there might be some sort of link between the given and what's not the given, right? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, so the problem of induction is kind of a question about how do you get knowledge of the future, right? Because David Hume basically made the argument that if you try to make an inference from the regularity of the past to the future, then you have assumed that the future is going to be like the past, right?
Right.
And so kind of the issue comes up is that it's okay, like, to make if we take a glass of marbles, right, and you're reaching in to take them out and to determine the colors, right? You can't see what's in the jar, but if you pull out 5 green ones, then if every marble in there has had an equal chance of being taken out, then you've got some justification then for thinking that the rest of the marbles are going to be green. But the problem is, when we're dealing with the future, we don't have that, because nothing that we have experienced in the past was part of the future. So kind of a regular inductive inference that we might make when all the particulars have had an equal chance of being selected, it won't apply to the future. And so that's the essence of the problem there. The solution isn't simple, unfortunately. It's difficult to explain, but there's a theorem. It's called Bernoulli's theorem, and you use this to basically take basic point observations. So you can make a series of arguments like that. You fit them into Bernoulli's theorem, and you can actually make probabilistic inductive inferences about the future. And so that is How you solve it, unfortunately, it's very technical. So for people who want the details, I would refer you to Bernoulli's work or to Timothy and Lydia McGrew have a book called Internalism and Epistemology. The last chapter of the book breaks all of that down and explains it in much more detail. But that's the gist of it.
Right, and so I think it's sort of interesting how, now of course that's induction, right? So it has to do with how do we know, like, for example, that our past memories are actually happened? Like, how do we know they just weren't implanted by some evil demon or some, simulation thing? Which is, and how do we know that God didn't create the universe 5 seconds ago, right? Like those sort of skeptical scenarios are the problem of induction, right? And I think there might be a sort of way to solve it. But now, what about the problem of induction? That sounds of course it's different, but does that have to do with deductive premises, or I don't know, what's the explanation for that?
All right, so the one I just explained, that was the problem of induction. Are you asking about the problem of deduction?
Yeah. So
okay.
Yeah.
Right. So this is basically the question about laws of logic, right? Epistemic principles. So something like the law of non-contradiction, right? No two contradictory propositions can both be true at the same time and in the same sense. Well, how do I know that that's true? And the difficulty here is that any argument that I give for, the truth of the law of non-contradiction, and there are a whole bunch of them out there, is that arguments depend on the truth of logical laws. Right? When you go from premises to conclusion, the way that the conclusion follows is through the truth of these logical laws. So if the question comes up, how are we to justify these logical laws? You are not going to be able to do that from premises to conclusion without begging the question. But I would also say it's a mistake to think that that's the only way that you can give justification, right? Because if you think that the only way you can justify something is from premises to conclusion, then you all of a sudden start a very interesting sort of infinite regress, right? Like lay out an argument here, right? Premise, conclusion. If I want justification for either of those premises, and you think that the only way you can get justification is through an argument, well, now for each of these for each of these premises, you've got to give me another argument, right? Premises to that conclusion. And I can, again, ask for justification for any premise. And so you get like this interesting, like tree branching out, right, of all of these premises, and it just goes on forever. And so like the original argument, the conclusion never gets justified. So we have to reject this idea that the only way we can justify our beliefs is through arguments. So then this, again, goes back to the question of premise acceptability. How is it that we get acceptable premises for an argument? And so when we're discussing empirical beliefs, again, I would go back to that idea of the given. Things get a little trickier when we're talking about epistemic principles, right? Abstract, metaphysical universals and things like that.
Right, yeah.
So the strategy here is to appeal to this idea of analyticity. And this is a subset of a priori knowledge. So for anyone who's not familiar with the idea of the a priori, this is the idea that we can have knowledge independent of any kind of experience, right? So if I tell you that a circle is not a square, are you justified in believing that? I would say yes, you are justified in believing that a circle is not a square, wholly apart from any sort of
argument,
any sort of any empirical knowledge. It's something that you know just by virtue of knowing what the terms mean. So it's sometimes called truth in virtue of meaning. And there's synthetic a priori, which is a different thing. But analytic a priori is specifically this idea that you could have truth just in virtue of meaning. And so I would apply that idea of analyticity to the laws of logic. That is, anyone who understands that what a contradiction means, if you understand what a contradiction means, you understand the idea of truth, right, a correspondence to reality, then you will understand if I say that two contradictory things cannot be true at the same time and in the same sense. If you know what those terms mean, your mind will grasp that as being true. Now, the skeptic can come along and say, oh, well, how do I know that your mind has grasped that as true? I can't show you that. I don't have any way to show you the contents of my own mind. However, notice that that's just a complaint, right? That's a complaint about the sort of justification that I'm giving, that it's that it's not public. But that doesn't in any way mean that I don't have the justification for that belief. In fact, that's
right.
what I do.
Because if you're internalism, then you would be justified even if they don't think you're, so.
Right. And here's kind of an interesting thing is if we think about logic, like if I laid out a syllogism here, right? Like the first one I encountered was the Kalam cosmological argument. And regardless of whether you think it's a good argument, I think we could agree that at least it is, it's valid. The conclusion follows if the premises are true. Now, I recognize that before I ever had any sort of training in epistemology, any training in logic, I recognize that if these premises are true, then that conclusion is entailed from them. And so notice I didn't have any justification for belief in the laws of logic. I didn't even know what the laws of logic were at the time. I had just recognized that. And so what Tim McGrew says on that is that syllogisms are an aid for people who understand logic. He says they don't exist for people who are logically blind. So kind of an illustration of this might be like if you and a blind man were, walking along and, you come to a street and there's this, truck coming and you tell him, like, stop, there's a truck there. And he says, oh, well, I don't believe you. Can you show me that? Can you prove to me that there's a truck there? You can't do it. Does that mean you're not justified in it? No. So, if the skeptic is, just going to reject it, okay, well, I can't show him that my mind has grasped the analytic truth of logical laws. My belief in them is still justified, even if I can't show him why they are. So kind of that's my strategy, is reject the idea that you have to prove things through argument alone. That gets rid of the circularity problem. And then adopt the idea of analyticity, the idea that things can be true in virtue of meaning.
Yeah, it's really good because I was getting a few questions in regards to like, well, how do we justify the laws of logic without presupposing the laws of logic? And it seems like this is a sort of solution to that problem where it's like, well, we use this sort of things to help clarify things, right? So, yeah, what was it called again? Because I know you mentioned it in the beginning. What was the sort of solution to that issue?
Of that, well, it was rejecting the idea of that everything had to be justified through an argument, and So things don't have to be justified.
Yeah, because I feel like that would help to sort of clarify the particular's position as well, where it's like, well, I can know things even if I may not necessarily have an argument to show like each step in my knowledge. So basically, it's like, well, I can know things even if I can't necessarily like lay out exactly how I know it, right?
Right.
And I think it's
not everything is known from premise to conclusion. And if you think it is, then you immediately generate this like huge mega regress that goes on endlessly. So the only hope really here is to adopt the idea of immediate justification. And again, we have that in experience, right? We have that through the given. And I think there are very strong arguments for the given. We can get into those if you want, but it seems that we could have a similar sort of thing with the mind, that the mind can have immediate justification for things like logical laws without the need for arguments.
Right. And I think that's a good point to point out that, we're talking about immediate experience and we're talking about the laws of logic. Those seem to be sort of immediately known. And not only that, but I mean, I think Tim pointed something out as well, where if we deny the laws of logic, then we're going to run into these sort of absurdities, right? So if you deny the law of non-contradiction, or if you deny those sort of classical laws of logic, or even just any laws, like you're going to run into a lot of problems, right? So yeah, but so another thing I wanted to sort of talk to you about, and this was sort of reason why I want to do this sort of discussion with you, is I've been getting a lot of emails about Boltzmann brains, solipsism, and like how we know we're not Boltzmann brains, or how we know we're not the only minds that exist, right? So the first, I guess, I'll go over some of the first emails, and we can sort of get our thoughts on this. But it started off like a few weeks ago. I don't know why. I can't explain why, but I just found it very very weird why this was happening. So one of the first things they wanted to point out was that, especially with Boltzmann brains, was that it's more statistically likely that I'm a Boltzmann brain rather than me living in an actual universe. And this is done through showing, I guess, the fine tuning. Like it's more likely that that a random fluctuation of particles are going to come together and form a brain, rather than me living in an actual universe with life and all that stuff. Now, my response to that was that that basically we can avoid that problem. We can so there's two things we can do. Either one, we deny that there's a multiverse, or two, what we can do is say that the multiverse is guided so that it doesn't do that, right? So that God, for example, wouldn't allow a Boltzmann brain to come about, because that's not his intention. His intention is not to create Boltzmann brains. His intention is to create an actual universe with life in it. So we can either deny that there is a multiverse and therefore the problem doesn't exist, or we can say that the multiverse is guided. So sort of accept some sort of like a guided multiverse hypothesis so that you don't run into this problem, right? So then like all the alternative possibilities are sort of ruled out. So you have more, it's more constrained. Right. And I pointed that out, and his response to me was, well, how do I know that God, didn't do that? How do I know that God didn't create a Boltzmann brain? And then how do I know that, like, I think it goes back to the whole solipsism problem, where it's like, well, how did I know that I didn't just think of God in my head just to avoid this problem altogether? Right. What's your thoughts on that?
Right. So Boltzmann brain is not my area of expertise, but
I think it does relate to solipsism, so that might sort of
right. Yeah. So my thought here, though, is that it seems, if I've understood Boltzmann brains correctly, is that theoretically, whatever the probability is that that Boltzmann brain situation is going to be more likely than an actual world. First of all, I'm curious how that probability gets determined, and it seems like it's going to be based on premises that are less obvious than that there is a real world. Now, I should give a qualifier there, is that we can't have certainty beyond those the foundation. So we got to get rid of the idea that like certainty does not transfer up to higher levels of epistemic justification. You have certainty at that given phenomenon of those simple analytic truths. Beyond that, you don't have certainty. So we're going on probability here. And so, if we're asking a question like, how do I know I'm not the only person who exists, right? Well, whatever the probability is on that, again, I'm not sure how that gets determined in Boltzmann brains, but whatever the probability is, that would be more likely intrinsically overturned by sufficient evidence. Any probability, no matter how low, can theoretically be overturned by sufficient evidence. And so we'd have to say, what is the evidence that, there is a real world out there? Well, we don't know things outside of our own minds, right? We can't get outside of our own minds, but we do know that we're given these certain things, right? Are our own minds conjuring these up? That's a possibility. It doesn't seem likely, right? You've got to deal with the problem of learning. You've got to deal with the problem of surprises. Both of those seem extremely unlikely if your own mind is generating things. So it does seem that we have a good reason just from given phenomena to think that there is something external to ourselves. Now, what would that be? Could that be like a mad scientist making us see things that are there? Maybe we're living in the Matrix, right? Or maybe they're being caused by for me as the substance dualist, maybe as a real, by real mind independent objects, or for the idealist, the real
mind-dependent objects.
Mind-dependent objects, yes, like that. What is really there, and that is not, in some sense, it's not just an illusion. And so the way that we kind of get there is through probability, and specifically this idea of confirmation theory. So in confirmation theory, when you have a theory that is, I'm trying to think what the phrase is. I think it's called a higher initial credibility. When you have two theories and one of them has a higher initial credibility, meaning it's more intuitive to you, then even if the hypotheses are confirmed to the same degree by a prediction, the probability still goes up more highly on the one that had the higher initial credibility. And so it seems to me that we have good reasons to think that there is a higher initial credibility for the idea that there is a real world out there outside of our own head. And so when we make a prediction with that, even if the prediction is explained equally well by the hypothesis that there's a mad scientist, on the basis of confirmation theory, we can say it's not confirmed to the same degree because it's got a lower initial credibility there. And that's just assuming that you're giving them the same starting probability. But you don't even have to do that. I think that we've got really good reason to think these other hypotheses, like the mad scientist, it's incredibly ad hoc, right? You've got to posit not only the mad scientist, you've got to posit all of whatever he's doing to give you these ideas. So it's incredibly contrived, incredibly ad hoc, and that makes the prior probability on it go down so much.
There's a lot more commitment. Well, not commitments, but like there's a lot more assumptions that go into explaining your own experiences, right?
Right. And so I think it has actually a simpler hypothesis just to say that there is a real external world. So again, we don't have proof. We're not going to have proof of that.
Right.
But we certainly can probabilistically show.
And it also applies too, because one of the responses I get is like, well, I point that out in my response to the emails. It's like, well, I point that out. It's like, well, it's just not likely that this is to happen. And their response is like, well, how do I know that the mad scientist isn't giving me the probability itself? Like, how do I know that confirmation theory isn't itself something that the mad scientist is giving me? It's like, well, I can't show you for absolute certainty whether that's happening or not. But the point is, it's still unlikely. Every time you add in these new commitments, you're making the hypothesis more and more ad hoc, right?
Right. And I think that there are good reasons, by the way, to think that these sorts of things are actually known a priori. So things like numbers, for example, is the mad scientist giving you the idea of numbers, or are these things that are actually not exactly analytic truths, but are known a priori? And I would say yes. But it doesn't matter if you're a realist or a nominalist with regard to numbers, whatever you take it, your knowledge of them can exist a priori. So I think the idea of the a priori, I would encourage this gentleman to study that idea, study the concept of a priori justification, because believe me, that will do wonders for working through these skeptical ideas and such.
Yeah, because I mean, especially with the confirmation theory, like, so would you say that it's that confirmation theory, like probability, is itself a priori? So like the truth of using that to determine other beliefs, or is that itself a priori, or what do you think?
I would say so. I don't think it's based on experience, and so any knowledge that you have that's not assuming that is knowledge, then you have that, then you know that a priori. So yes, I would say it is. As far as it goes, I'm not an expert in confirmation theory, so from what I can tell, most of it is it's mathematics and stuff, and mathematics is certainly a priori. So if there are other elements in there, I would guess that they also that it's a purely a priori discipline.
Yeah. So I guess we could close off here. And this I guess this is the last response I'm going to do for one of the emails. So. I pointed out how God would sort of solve this problem, because if God doesn't have the intention to create Boltzmann brains and all that stuff, then of course that's not going to happen. So he said, and this is from the actual email itself. So he says that say a Boltzmann brain came up with the conclusion that God destroys the problem of being a Boltzmann brain because that is what the universe within its mind shows based on the evidence. But clearly, this mind doesn't know it's a Boltzmann brain. How could we use How could we use what is created by our mind to reason whether there is a God or not? Couldn't I be a Boltzmann brain right now that has thought up the argument that God destroys Boltzmann brains, even though I don't know right now that I was actually created in a universe by chance? So basically, he's saying like, well, how do I know that I wasn't created in a universe by chance? So I can create this idea of God destroying the Boltzmann brain argument. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say most of the arguments that I've given from on the information theory and on the basis of simplicity, they don't actually depend on the reality of God. So I guess for me, that's also going to depend on if you think you can get God through an a priori argument, and I think that there are good a priori arguments for the existence of God. But if you can get that, then it's not going to just be something that the Boltzmann brain, made you think of. If you don't think that you can get God out of an a priori argument, then consider the other arguments I gave, because they don't depend on a theistic premise.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, I just wanted to, I use that as a way to sort of respond to the argument that, maybe we can just get rid of this whole Boltzmann brain issue by just saying that God would not intend, right? Because the Boltzmann brains, they only arise on a non-theistic multiverse hypothesis, right? So it's only an issue if you accept a non-theistic multiverse hypothesis. But if you accept like a theistic multiverse hypothesis, then you're not going to run into that problem, right? So that's why I use it as a sort of response to the problem. But
yeah, and I mean, you've also got the issue here with the multiverse is that why should you think that there's a multiverse in the first place? Because that's a much more complicated hypothesis than there's not. And whatever evidence you're giving for a multiverse, I don't think that can be stronger than the evidence for the reality of an external world. So it seems like whatever probabilistic calculations go into this Boltzmann brain, it already depends on a lot of premises that are already less plausible, less probable rather than the reality of the external world.
Right. Okay. I think that'll be it. There's not much else. So I guess we can summarize. So basically, foundationalism solves the problem of the regress problem, and in particularism seems to solve the problem of the criterion, right? And then that is of course answered by the given, right? So the given is itself what justifies
immediately justified.
Yeah. Now I know there's one objection to the given. I don't think it works, but it's the seller's dilemma.
Yes.
I know you're familiar with it. I know there's probably response to that as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, the Salarzian dilemma basically just asks how basically it's a question of how is it that the given is justifying a belief, right? Because obviously the given itself is not doing it, right? And your belief isn't doing it. So there's got to be some link between your belief and the given. And this is, cashed out usually in terms of acquaintance, right? So that you're acquainted. Right. So what is acquaintance then, right? It's not a belief, right? It's supposed to be what justifies the belief. So the objection is, well, is that oh goodness, I can't think of the exact word here. Is it conceptual? That's what it is. They want to say, is it conceptual or is it not, right? Because if it is conceptual, then they say then it needs its own justification. If it's not conceptual, then how is it conferring justification? So I would reject the idea that it is conceptual. I would say it is non-conceptual. Paul Moser really dives into this in his book on it, but he has this idea of attention attraction, right? So if you see two lines, right, I forget what the name of the technical names for all these effects. Let's instead go with the idea of a pencil and a glass of water. You have a pencil and a glass of water, it looks bent to you, right? Even though you might know that it's not. But it's not something that is conceptual, right? You're not conceptualizing that the pencil is bent. It's given to you that way. And in fact, your conceptualization is that it's really not bent. So conceptualization depends on the idea that there is actually non-conceptual content that is given to you. And pretty much every argument from guys like Sellers and Bergman that I've heard against the idea of non-conceptual sensory awareness that has content and so is therefore capable of conferring justification while itself not being in need of any, they're all extremely question-begging. So basically the Salarzian dilemma, it's really non-existent. This idea of acquaintance, that solves it. You're acquainted with the given, and that is how it confers justification onto your beliefs.
Right. Okay. And of course, that would answer the other issues with regards to inductive and deductive problems. But
Yeah, the answer on induction is a little more complicated, but it's suffice to say there is a solution.
All right. I guess before we close off, what are some books? I know you have tons of them, but like, what are like the introductions to get into this subject?
Let's see. On the problem of the criterion and the regress problem, let me recommend Paul Moser. His book Knowledge and Evidence is it's very clear. He makes a good case for foundationalism. He addresses the Salarzian dilemma. A lot of great, just information in that book. It's really one of the most underrated books in epistemology, and he's very readable as well, like as philosophers go. So yeah, Paul Moser's Knowledge and Evidence is a good place on some of those questions. The problem of induction. There's a few places you can go. There's a book called Hume's Problem by Colin Howson. He gives some interesting thoughts on it. I don't think his solution works, but it's a good place to get introduced to it and why it's difficult. A better one is, and this just came out in 2019, was Gerhard Schertz. He's a German philosopher, but he wrote a book called Hume's Problem Solved. It's very technical, but he gets into like the arithmetic of it all and lays it out. If you want just a simpler treatment, again, the last chapter of Timothy and Lydia McGrew's Internalism and Epistemology. They also have a chapter in that book on the problem of deduction, right? So how do we know that the laws of logic are true without presupposing them? So they go through that. And on that problem as well, you might see Paul Boghosian's paper, Knowledge of Logic, where he, again, shows that logic can be justified a priori. And so I think that was all the problems.
Okay, good. All right. Well, hopefully that answers. So like every time someone sends me an email about Boltzmann brains or so, I'm just gonna send them this video because that's all you need to know. So
do the research yourself.
Yeah. So anyways, thanks for coming on, David. I appreciate it. It's really dark in my room, so I gotta close off here. But yeah. All right, guys. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.